Behind the shimmering facade of ancient Rome, the grandeur of marble columns and the glow of golden palaces, lay a terror that history has often relegated to the shadows. As we praise Rome's conquests, its victorious armies, its soaring architecture, and the might of its laws, we often forget that this splendor was paid for in blood, tears, and human lives. The heaviest price was paid by the young male servants, or delicati, who were dragged into the arms of the wealthy and powerful. These boys were not mere slaves or ordinary servants. They were human beings whose youth, bodies, and defenseless souls were brutally consumed by Rome's elite. Their stories shatter our romantic ideals of the empire and expose, with raw horror, what it meant to be powerless in a world where might was the only right. Rome's concept of privacy was far different from our own. The line between consent and coercion was erased in the shadow of power. At the bottom of this hierarchy were young males, often taken from conquered lands or born into slavery. Without any say of their own, they were thrown into terrifying roles. Some of these young people were barely children. They were chosen not for their intellect or skills, but for the beauty of their bodies, the innocence in their faces, or their charm to entertain their masters. They lived in constant fear, waiting to be summoned from the shadows, never knowing what awaited them. They existed on a thin line between obedience and death, silence and violence, in a perpetual state of uncertainty. The selection process itself was a form of torture. Rome's powerful men would enter slave markets as if they were livestock fairs, examining young bodies with cold eyes, appraising their age, origin, and flesh as though they were commodities. Greek youths were valued for their grace and education, while those of Germanic origin were prized for their pale skin and strong build. But in those moments, no one saw the fear gripping the hearts of the naked and vulnerable children. For them, these bodies were just a subject for negotiation, an object of flesh. Once purchased, their souls were no longer their own. From that moment on, they were chained to the shadow of their master, condemned to be lost in the dark desires of their owner. They were expected to be ready at all times. They were expected to anticipate their master's needs before a word was spoken, to wear a smile on their lips, and to appear willing, as if desire filled their souls. Yet inside, the only sound was a muffled, chained scream. The psychological devastation of this existence was indescribable. Imagine, you are forced to smile and show gratitude while your honor, dignity, and freedom are being systematically shattered. The daily life of a young page was shaped by his master's whims. Some were kept in opulent rooms, draped in fine silks, polished with a veneer of culture and wisdom. But every gift was a hidden shackle. Others lived in dark cells, indistinguishable from those of common slaves. They were brought into their master's presence only when summoned, then sent back to their dim dungeons, where privacy, ownership, and hope were non-existent. What made their situation most tragic was their absolute lack of protection. While Roman law granted citizens rights and even afforded certain protections to slaves, these young male servants were abandoned in a legal void. Here, the master's desire was above the law and beyond mercy. They could not seek refuge with authorities, nor could they form genuine bonds or voice their pain. Every word could be an excuse for punishment. The psychological chains left deeper marks than physical ones. Masters would play games to break their resistance, sometimes offering false affection, at other times granting poisonous privileges. But these favors would be withdrawn at the slightest fault, and the gifts would turn into punishments. So, the boys lived in a state of constant uncertainty, never knowing if they were still in their master's favor. They were often isolated from the rest of the household, denied the chance to form friendships, share secrets, or find solace in another human being. For these youths, torn from their families and roots, solitude was more than torture. It was a tool to strip them of their old identities and cultures, turning them into faceless ghosts in their master's shadow. In some households, competition magnified the torture. Masters with multiple young servants would intentionally pit them against each other, sowing seeds of jealousy instead of solidarity, betrayal instead of support. Youths sharing the same fate would compete for their master's favor instead of helping each other. The price of losing was often heavier chains. And even education was a trap. Reading, writing, philosophy, knowledge that at first glance seemed like a light, was in fact a new chain. They were expected to discuss literature and politics, but only in ways that pleased their masters. Wisdom was not freedom for them, but a more gilded cage. Their training was not just about acquiring knowledge, but a ritual to chain the soul. They were broken and remade according to their master's pleasure. Their bodies had to be preserved like statues, forever marked with youth and charm. Strict diets, relentless exercises, and painful grooming all were for the purpose of becoming the ideal figure in the master's eyes. Some, as if being shaped in a sacred fire of pain, would be subjected to a primitive surgeon's knife, their faces and bodies carved to their master's fantasy. No medicine, no mercy, just blood, trembling flesh, and echoing screams. The silks and gold they were made to wear were not a crown, but a chain. Though they shimmered with dazzling ornaments, the weight of each stone held the stamp of their slavery. They were living puppets, breathing toys. Even journeys brought not the wind of freedom, but the portability of their chains. They were shadows dragged from city to city, forced to kneel in the same submission on the cold stones of new lands. Behind the magnificent walls of Roman homes, invisible crowns of thorns were woven for these young male servants. They appeared to live in luxury, but their place in the hierarchy was less than a ghost. Slaves looked down on them, while masters saw them only as temporary playthings. Meanwhile, the families they left behind were plunged into a dark unknown. Mothers and fathers cried prayers to the sky, not knowing whether their sons were dead or alive. And the gods answered with silence. The dark cycle of debt sometimes forced families to sacrifice their sons. A child torn from his mother's heart became the price to save his other siblings from the shadow of hunger. The weight of this sacrifice would shatter the souls of both the families and the boys, leaving a lifelong shadow. Sometimes freedom would reach their ears like a whisper, and the young men would risk their lives to break their chains. But their failure was punished not just with torture, but with public humiliation. Masters would break their will in front of crowds, declaring their absolute power. Some wanted to find their only escape in death. But even suicide was denied to them. Masters watched their living property so closely they couldn't even die on their own terms, denied steel, rope, or poison. Even the power of the gods ignored them. While deities of justice and protection were praised in temples, the prayers of these young servants were lost in a void. Some sought refuge in the dim candlelight of secret cults. Others hoped for solace in the dark embrace of foreign gods. But even this was forbidden, for masters had chained not only their bodies, but their souls. Thus, they lived as shadows under gold and silk, slaves to pain, silence, and oblivion. The value placed on young male servants fueled a brutal market that thrived on capturing and selling young bodies. Wealthy Romans competed with each other to obtain the most beautiful and talented shadows, driving up prices and encouraging traders to continue this dark commerce. Human life was reduced to a simple monetary calculation. The souls of young men were commodified and sold as property. Like the schools where gladiators were trained for the arena, there were also brutal training institutions for these young male servants. These schools were as cruel as they were profitable, systematically breaking the will and spirit of the pupils while teaching them the skills demanded by their future masters. The curriculum enslaved not just the body but the mind, aiming to produce submissive, beautiful, and charming companions. Those who fell into this dark fate at a young age never learned what a normal relationship, their own desires, or human connection meant. While regional differences provided some variation in the treatment of these young men, the lack of freedom and honor was universal. In some provinces, conditions might have been slightly better, in others even harsher, but everywhere, the weight of the chains remained the same. When they grew old or lost their charm, another kind of pain began. While a slave could sometimes buy his freedom, these male servants were often abandoned with nothing or sold to households with worse conditions. Those who did gain their freedom were rare. They had to reinvent themselves, hiding their past and battling the psychological scars. Medical care was provided not out of mercy, but to maintain a valuable piece of property. Masters wanted their investment to remain healthy and appealing. No one cared about their mental well-being or long-term health. This system also exposed the moral framework of the Roman elite. Honor, duty, and virtue belonged only to free citizens. The suffering of these young men was an invisible void. They were dehumanized, silent shadows. Some developed strategies for survival, learning to read their master's mood, anticipating their desires, and managing the complex social dynamics of the household. But these skills turned them into perpetual actors. They had to display satisfaction and gratitude with false smiles while suppressing the pain within. At great festivals and celebrations, they were expected to be a part of the entertainment. During quieter periods, there was only temporary respite, but anxiety followed them everywhere. They never knew when a next summons would come. Communication with other servants was often forbidden, but they secretly managed to form networks of support and information. Silent gestures, coded words, they would console each other in difficult moments and warn each other about their master's mood. These secret bonds were like a vital breath in their dark and isolated lives. And this entire system affected not just individuals, but all of Roman society. Treating people as objects for pleasure and ownership became normalized. Exploitation and dehumanization became a cultural current running through the empire. The gold, silks, and glittering stones could not hide the pain masked by this dark order. For the young servants lived like eternal shadows, invisible, forgotten, and chained. This cultural acceptance made it easier for Romans to justify other forms of cruelty and oppression, from the gladiator arenas to the brutal suppression of slave revolts. Archaeology whispers only shadows of the dark lives of these forgotten victims. Objects from the homes of wealthy Romans carry clues about the tools used to monitor and control the young servants, and about their silent, daily suffering. But the relentless march of time has destroyed most physical evidence, ensuring they remain as silent as they were in life. The literary references by Roman writers to young male servants were often brief and veiled. They preferred to hint at the relationships delicately rather than acknowledge the horrific reality. But between the lines, it is possible to read the bitter truth of a life woven with powerlessness and exploitation. The transition periods of being sold from one master to another were a nightmare for these young men. The uncertainty of new homes, different expectations, and varying levels of cruelty or mercy turned every step into a vortex of fear. Each transition meant learning to survive all over again, while trying to protect the psychological defenses that had kept them alive in the previous life. Some masters saw their young servants as temporary entertainment, quickly losing interest and relegating them to common slave duties. Others, while fundamentally exploitative, would develop a long-term attachment, offering a degree of stability and predictability. Yet, true security was never an option. The fate of the young servant was entirely determined by the master's whim. The seasonal migrations of wealthy Romans between city homes and rural villas dragged these young men through different environments and social contexts. This constant adaptation required an extraordinary psychological resilience, preventing them from ever putting down roots or forming lasting bonds. The education given to these young men in music, poetry, and literature was a cruel irony. They were taught to appreciate beauty and culture, but they were never given the right to be creators or contributors themselves. They became living vessels of knowledge, but all their talents were used for the pleasure and entertainment of others. The physical training regimes were imposed to make them attractive in their master's eyes, but these regimens were often extreme and painful. The young men were forced to submit to all the exercises, dietary restrictions, and bodily modifications their masters imposed. Seasonal celebrations and festivals created extra pressures, as they were forced to participate in lavish entertainments. What appeared joyful from the outside was, in their world, just another opportunity for humiliation and exploitation. The relationships these young men had with other household members were complex due to their ambiguous status. While they lived in relative luxury, everyone knew their position was entirely dependent on their master's whim. Genuine friendship or love was nearly impossible. The trade networks that supplied young males for this purpose stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. This system encouraged warfare, kidnapping, and debt slavery, profoundly affecting the lives of victims and even entire communities. The training and preparation of these young men involved psychological manipulation designed to break their resistance and create dependency. Masters and their agents were skilled in techniques of systematic abuse, finding and exploiting every weakness, subjecting young bodies and souls completely to their desires. The clothing and ornaments of these young men were not just for adornment, but also a mark of status and the master's wealth, a constant reminder of their lack of freedom. Their physical appearance wasn't even their own. The medical and grooming practices were often painful, dangerous, and permanently disfiguring. These procedures were performed without regard for the young men's consent or comfort, turning their bodies into objects for the master's desires. They lived as ostentatious objects, adorned with gold and silk, but carried a silent shadow within, a chained soul. Every glance, every touch, every ornament was a reminder of a piece of their humanity that had been stolen. For this life was built entirely on existing for the pleasure and desire of others. To grow up or spend one's formative years under such dark and painful conditions left deep, lasting wounds on the spirits of these young men. They never learned fundamental human concepts like approval, autonomy, and healthy relationships. Even if they gained their freedom, it was almost impossible to break free from the chains of their past. Social isolation was a deliberate cruelty for many. Masters kept them alone to prevent them from finding outside support or alliances. The economic calculations that determined their fate reduced human life to a simple monetary value. Age, appearance, talent, and origin determined varying prices. This objectification justified their masters treating them as disposable objects rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. The impact of such exploitation on Roman society extended beyond the victims. A culture that could accept the systematic abuse of vulnerable young men was also ready to accept other forms of cruelty. This fueled the cycle of oppression and suffering that defined much of Roman history. The rare examples of resistance and rebellion showed the desperate measures these young men would take to preserve their humanity and dignity. Though these acts of defiance were often futile and harshly punished, they proved that the human spirit could not be entirely extinguished even under the most oppressive conditions. The religious and philosophical systems of the Romans offered no meaningful protection or solace to these victims. While complex discussions on ethics and virtue were held, no contradiction was seen between these high ideals and the systematic exploitation of powerless young men. The seasonal rhythms of Rome created a predictable pattern of exploitation for the young servants. Certain times of the year demanded more of their time and bodies, and even quiet periods were haunted by the constant fear of the next summons. The families, communities, and cultures from which these young men were taken were also victims of this dark order. The loss of young males to this trade affected not just the immediate victims, but the entire social fabric, contributing to the widespread pain created by Roman expansion and exploitation. The training and preparation of these young men involved systematic cruelty aimed at breaking their psychological defenses and creating absolute obedience. These methods were refined over generations, creating a system that was both efficient and devastating. Roman law did not recognize these young men as individuals with rights. They were considered property, and their suffering was rendered invisible. Masters acted with complete impunity while society looked the other way. Economic incentives ensured this cycle of exploitation was self-perpetuating. The profit from human trafficking fueled the capture and continued abuse of young men. Breaking this cycle would have required a radical change in Roman society's core values, but such a change never happened. The physical and psychological conditioning imposed on them aimed to create absolute conformity. These young men were systematically stripped of their autonomy, their dignity, and their sense of self. Even if they achieved freedom, they could never reclaim these fundamental aspects of being human. Though adorned with gold and silk, they carried a chained soul inside. Every glance, every touch, every ornament was a reminder of the pieces of their humanity that had been stolen. This life was a silent tragedy, existing only for the pleasure and desire of others. Every smile, every adorned garment, every obedient glance hid a silent scream within, a terror that echoed in their submissive bodies and souls. And these stories, which never vanished into the silent shadows of history, whisper to us as a lament for humanity. The splendor of great civilizations is often built upon unspeakable cruelties, broken souls, and the screams of young bodies. It is our duty to understand and accept this dark truth, to honor the suffering, and to ensure that such systematic dehumanization is never again the hidden price of progress.